let me introduce Paul Schmitz, who leads Public Allies. Paul is the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. He was awarded the Social Capitalist Award for Innovation by Fast Company and serves on the White House Council of Community Solutions. Through his work at Public Allies, Paul helps millennials begin their careers with community and social change organizations. And more than 4,400 young leaders in 21 communities have participated as a Public Allies member. So please help me welcome Paul Schmitz.
Thanks, Nadir. So, whoops. First technical glitch. Well, first I need to start with a confession today. Some of you may have read this week that there was a novel published in April called The Cuckoo's Call by the author John Gilbraith. And it was announced earlier this week that it was actually authored by J.K. Rowling, and its sales went from 1,500 to 300,000. I'm here to announce today that J.K. Rowling also wrote this book, Everyone Leads. And and it's not far-fetched if you think about it. Because I have a daughter, Olivia, who's a hardcore Potterhead, and she tells me, who's the hero of Harry Potter? Is it Harry? Or she tells me that, you know, if we look, he couldn't have done anything if Hermione hadn't known all the spells. If Ron hadn't gone into the Chamber of Secrets to get the Horcrux with the basilisk fang. If Luna Lovegood hadn't taken him to see the ghost of Gryffindor. If McGonagall hadn't organized a faculty to give him time and protect him. If Neville Longbottom hadn't led in his absence and then killed the snake. Yes, I got a full lecture on this morning from my daughter. But the reality is that leadership, when we think about leadership, our history often gives it to us as a story of heroes. And what I'm here is to really democratize that definition and think differently about leadership. And to start, I want to begin with a leadership story. And it's a story we all know. It's the story of Rosa Parks. But do we all know the real story of what happened that day? It starts with, it's not moving. There we go. So it starts with Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks was often portrayed, including in a recent White House press release, as an accidental activist who was just a tired seamstress that day. What many people don't know is that she'd been a long-term activist. She had married her husband, Raymond, because she was inspired by his activism in the Scottsboro Boys case in 1931, in which a group of 9 African-American men were falsely accused of rape. And Raymond had been a big activist on that case. It had been taken by the American Communist Party. It was the only group that would represent these 9 boys in Alabama. And Raymond Parks had gotten active in that. It's one of the reasons why she fell in love with him. In the mid-40s, she met Edie Nixon, and the two of them ran to lead the local NAACP. He as president, she as secretary. At that time, the local NAACP had been mostly staffed by professionals from a local university. And they were working-class people who took it over. In 1945, she then went to trainings. Well, we skipped Ella Baker, who's there in the corner. Ella Baker shouldn't be skipped. She went to 2 trainings in Florida and Tennessee by the great NAACP field organizer, Ella Baker, who inspired her to create a youth council at the local NAACP in Montgomery. She then did work for Virginia and Clifford Durr, who were leftists who'd been involved with the Highlander Community Center in Tennessee. And they sponsored her and raised money to send her there to go through a 2-week nonviolent civil disobedience training in 1955. It was there that she was trained by the great Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who stayed in touch with her and saw her as a leader with a lot of potential. Every day at lunch, she would meet with Fred Gray, who was a young attorney new to town in Montgomery. And she was trying to engage him in the NAACP's work. And so every day she had lunch with him to talk about change. Then, early in 1955, a member of her youth council, Claudette Colvin, 15 years old, refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. How many of you knew that she was the first one? But she was 15 years old. And they decided that she wasn't very sympathetic. The lawyers who wanted to challenge segregation decided she wasn't very sympathetic. And on top of that, she was accused of resisting arrest and became pregnant not long after the arrest, or was allegedly pregnant. We now know that wasn't true. But they decided not to take her case. Rosa Parks fought vigorously for the NAACP to move her case, and they didn't. Then we have Rosa Parks. She decides in December 1955 not to move to the back of the bus. She said, I wasn't a tired seamstress. I was tired of segregation. Edie Nixon and the Doers go to get her out of prison, and they spend the evening debating with her and her husband what to do about this. And Edie Nixon calls Joanna Robinson and Fred Gray. Joanna Robinson was a professor at Alabama State University who headed the Women's Political Council of the NAACP. And Joanna Robinson stayed up all night with a group of women making 15,000 flyers. Think about today's technology, what it would take to do that, and think about 1955 technology. 15,000 flyers overnight. And this is the best part, on state-owned equipment in a state that sanctioned segregation and Jim Crow laws. That's why she's got that little smile. So Joanna Robinson and Fred Gray were the next two calls. Fred Gray took the case, and Joanna Robinson mobilized the women overnight to start publicizing the boycott. Then Edie Nixon, before leaving on a train that morning, he was a porter in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, called a preacher named Ralph Abernathy and talked about how to get the pastors involved. And he said, we should call this young pastor Martin Luther King, who's new to town, he's 26. If they run him out of town, it's not a problem, because he doesn't have any kids, he's young, so let's give it to that guy. So he calls King, and King agrees to host a meeting of pastors that afternoon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Only one white pastor gets involved, who happened to be Rosa Parks' pastor, Reverend Grates. His home was bombed in retaliation for his participation in the boycott. Rufus Lewis owned bars on the outskirts of town that were kind of rough, and there were places they could have secret meetings at. But they had to figure out, how do you transport everyone to and from their jobs each day? They did not march for 12 months to work and back each day into the grocery store. He arranged a 350-car carpool that transported people every day, 350 cars between various points. Everyone got pulled over. Joanna Robinson got 17 speeding tickets for going 1 mile per hour over the limit. Then this is one of my favorite pieces. Georgia Gilmore and Inez Ricks, two form associations of women who cook and sell food in the community to raise money to support all the gas for the carpools. Then Ella Baker comes back and takes Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money. And the great organizers, Stanley Levinson and Bayard Rustin, helped create an organization called In Trust to support it. And Miles Horton and the Doers used the Highlander Network to raise money to support the Montgomery Improvement Association. And then it all went away. And then it comes back at some point. But Bayard Rustin was the master organizer who then came and taught them Gandhian nonviolence. And Bayard Rustin, who was an openly gay black man at that time in 1955, was a very controversial figure. And he left town early because he didn't want to hurt them, but he trained them all. And the thing he had them do is they indicted over 100 members of the community for participating in the boycott and leading it. And he suggested they all march down to City Hall together and turn themselves in, which they did, in the first mass action based on Gandhian principles. Then they decided that because Rosa Parks had been such a long-term activist in the NAACP and had been involved in the Scottsboro case and had known it to be a radical, that she wasn't a sympathetic character. So they found another woman who had refused to move on the bus and been arrested, Aurelia Boynton, and they took her case to the Supreme Court, which was the case that overturned segregation. So the question is, who was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? And that goes to my key story, which is social change has always come from the leadership of the many. Leaders at all levels and all kinds. If you think about that story, most of us thought growing up, well, Rosa Parks refused to sit, and that was this courageous stance, and then this young preacher took it on and started everyone marching, and it changed. And we don't realize that when you dig into any story in history, you find the number of leaders and the ways people led are so vast. But if we think about it only in terms of heroes, we lose the real story of leadership that should guide us in working for social change today. That all of us have a stake in leadership. We believe that leadership is like a muscle. Everyone leads does not mean everyone should be in charge of everything. That's chaos. What it does mean is that leadership's a muscle and everyone has it. And we need as many people as possible to exercise that muscle if we want to create change. Let me offer just a couple contemporary stories from my own organization. Bizinesh Talbot Scott was an 18-year-old single mom. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, a community college. She had a 3-year-old son. She was on public assistance. And she, in her own words, knew she was a smart girl, but had no idea of her potential. Biz was so smart that not only after completing her AmeriCorps program did she go on to university, but she went to University of Michigan Law School, made law review, and most recently was one of the directors of presidential personnel at the White House. Most people don't look at a single mom in community college and think White House lawyer. Peter Hoffel, a very different story. Peter was 27. He had a degree in philosophy from a local university. He was working at a deli, which mainly meant he could create really cool sandwich names. And one day a woman came out and asked if she could hang a public allies poster in the deli. And Peter started talking to her about it. And he said he was someone at that point in his life who would stay up late at night with his friends, drinking beer and talking about politics and social problems, but never really thought of himself as part of the solution. And that day he did. And today he's one of our state's top disability rights advocates and head of the National Alliance for Mental Illness in Wisconsin. Again, most people don't look at the person making sandwiches and think there's a leader. At Public Allies, we've done that over 5,000 times now, and we do it every year, and we find incredible talent throughout our communities. And we think that the talent and leadership we need is in this generation and is already in the communities that we work in. The reason why I'm so passionate about this is that was me. I was someone who struggled through my teens with depression and addiction, was institutionalized, was homeless for a period when this photo was taken. And no one would have thought of me as a leader. I certainly didn't think of me in that way myself. And fortunately, due to social services I received and mentorship from many people, I was able to get my life on track. And I think it's kind of natural when that happens to you, you want to help others as well. And then I ran into this organization that was trying to find young people who were passionate about making a difference and helping them turn that into a career working for community and social change. And that's how I found Public Allies. And I could have never imagined that 20 years later I'd be an advisor to the President of the United States, or that I'd be leading a network of over 5,000 leaders across the country. And it's because of my own path with all of its ups and downs that I believe so much in what young people can accomplish, because so many of the young people I hire now at Public Allies know way more than I ever could have conceived of when I was in my early 20s. The definition that guides us in this idea is, first, that leadership is an action everyone can do, not a position few people can hold. When we shift our focus from the noun to the verb, we open up the possibilities of who can participate in leadership. The second is the core work of leadership. Leaders take responsibility. Leaders are willing to do whatever it takes, learn whatever has to be learned, work with whoever we have to work with to accomplish a goal. That's what leadership is. We step up and we decide we're going to do this. And the third part's the secret sauce, which I'm going to talk about the rest of this presentation, which is values. Because if you think about why people are cynical about leaders, it's not often because they don't have skills. It's often because they don't listen, they're not engaging, they are boastful, they don't practice what they preach, they're not inclusive. It's all about values. And yet we don't talk a lot about leadership and values. The construct I like to use to talk about actually comes from the US Army. Their leadership manual is called Be, Know, Do. And the basic idea is, first I have to understand, who am I as a leader? What are my values? What's my mission? What am I good at? How do I work with others? And I have to master that before I gain the knowledge and skills to achieve that mission. I would argue most leadership programs in communities and on campuses focus on skills and knowledge and not enough focus on the be. But that really is the essence of leadership, is in that be. And at Public Allies, we've identified 5 values we think are essential today for people who want to make a difference in communities. The first is about recognizing and mobilizing all of a community's assets. And the person in the picture there is actually one of my co-founders at Public Allies, was Michelle Obama. And I have to say, we all knew she would go on to do great things, but we didn't know she would become a fashion icon. Most of our photos of her, she's in blue jeans and sweats. But Michelle and I, for 10 years, taught something called asset-based community development together. We were faculty members of this institute. And it's based on the idea of the proverbial glass and the question of whether it's half empty or half full. And we believe that the correct answer is yes. It is both, half empty and half full. And that this glass is like me, you, and our communities. All of us, I said Michelle gave a speech a few years ago, and she said, every single one of us have gifts and talents that make us great family members, friends, workers, and leaders. But we also have shortcomings. We've made mistakes. We have things we're not proud of that are also part of that. And the reality is that service often is about people who define themselves as full, going into communities they define as empty, with the notion that their job is to fill them up. We think at best that's arrogant, and at worst it's oppressive. We think leaders have to be able to find the fullness. We have to be able to stare into someone's emptiness or a community's emptiness and find that fullness. And we have to have the confidence in our fullness and humility about our own emptiness. Because none of us has the whole package. That's why we need to collaborate. That's why we need others. Because none of us has it all. The second is diversity and inclusion. And to us, what it's really about is diversity and inclusion in today's society is more essential than ever. And it's not something you believe in, it's something you do. The question for any millennial leader is, how do you intentionally and pay attention and make sure you do it, seek out to make sure everyone in your community who needs to be at the table is at the table? That you have relationships that span different networks and communities. That whether it's your social network or your in-person network, that you're making sure you're bringing all different kinds of people to your table. Because if you want the best solutions, you need different perspectives. You need different experiences. You have to challenge your thinking. And in this increasingly diverse society, it's incumbent on every leader not just to think, I believe in it, but to say actively, I'm going to demand that every table I sit at is inclusive of different parts of our community. And if it's not, I'm going to make sure it is. It's that accountability that distinguishes real inclusion from false inclusion. The third is collaboration. And leadership's inherently a collaborative act because it's something you do with others. But the reality is, there's all different styles. Again, if you're inclusive and you bring different assets and skills to your table, you're going to have differences. Some leaders are more visionary, some are more analytical, some are more mobilizers, some are more nurturing. And if you have all of that, you have a powerful team. But the reality is, if you have those differences, you're going to have conflict. And if you haven't done the activities and taken the time to build trust, then that conflict can only be destructive. If you do take the time to build that trust in relationships, then that conflict becomes constructive. And it's something out of which you can build better ideas because you're challenging each other and not getting stuck in groupthink. And you have those different perspectives at the table. The fourth is continuous learning. And about 8 years ago, Echo and Green Foundation in New York had asked me to speak to all their fellows who had created new nonprofit organizations. And they asked me to talk about how we built public allies. And I wrote that speech and realized it was utter BS and wouldn't help them at all. And I created a second presentation called The Worst Practices of Social Entrepreneurship, in which I cataloged our 10 biggest mistakes. But before sharing this publicly, I thought I should share it with our staff, because I'm about to go public with our biggest mistakes. But the first slide was called Things I Suck At. And it was a list of things that I suck at. And it included things like interpersonal conflict, personnel management, patience with process, paperwork, punctuality, small talk, active listening, trusting my instinct, delegating responsibility making. It goes on and on. Now, I was kind of terrified that day to put this list in front of my employees. And then something happened. Everyone started nodding. You know why? Because the things that you suck at aren't a secret. That emptiness we talked about, everyone sees it. And we all pretend like no one notices our mistakes or notices we're not good at it. Like if we're always late for meetings, no one notices it. Everyone notices it. And you have a choice as a leader. You can own it, which creates the opportunity for people to talk about it with you, or you don't own it and they'll talk about it without you. We all do that. I can't believe they always show up unprepared. We do that all the time. But as leaders, we can own it. And it doesn't give us an excuse to keep failing or doing it wrong, but it gives us the opportunity to get feedback and open ourselves to the feedback we need to continually improve as leaders. And finally, leadership's about integrity. And leaders have to be accountable and true to our B, that sense of our mission, our values, how we're going to do it, what we're going to do, what we're good at, to be true to all of that, but also to be accountable to those we work with, and especially those we serve. Those of us privileged enough to work in the social sector where I work get paid because of other people's problems. And we get paid on behalf of those communities. And we have to remember that our first accountability is not to the funders, not to the organizations, it's to the people we serve. Because it's in their behalf we do our work. And so we have to have the integrity to hold ourselves accountable and to define and always be true to our be. So with that, I just want to thank you all. And I'll be out later, and I just want to thank you all for taking the time to come here today. And I'm very excited about the work you're all going to continue to do, because every one of you can lead. Thank you.
Great stuff, right? Really great stuff. Have a seat.
All right.
We have a few minutes to chat. But I wanted to start actually by touching on something you said toward the end about how you get to the point that you can engage in these kinds of missions. Because one of the criticisms I hear about Gen Y often is that we haven't experienced adversity. We haven't been in that space where we have been at the bottom or suffered enough to make us excited or engaged in pursuing the things that you've talked about, that calling. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how you get millennials engaged and how you get them sort of interested in these causes when, for some of them, adversity is either a very remote thing or it's a very real thing, and that middle space is neglected.
Well, I think that, I guess that's the point. I mean, Trayvon Martin has experienced some really bad adversity, right? And we know our communities, there's incredible adversity.
Absolutely.
We have more disparity of wealth and opportunity in this country than ever. And so I think that the millennial generation is the most diverse in history, which means there's a lot of folks. And we have to remember, only 30% of Americans 25 or older have an undergraduate degree or a community college degree, which means over 60% of our young people aren't even going to any community college or university.
Say it again. 60%.
Over 60% of young people don't go to any community college or university. So the reality is that when we talk about the millennial generation, we have to reflect it in all of its nuance and diversity. And so I think that for those who haven't experienced adversity directly,
or diversity.
I think, again, it's incumbent on you if you want to be a leader in this society today. 2011 was the first year in which the majority of births were non-white. If you want to lead in the future, you have to be able to relate to people who are diverse, who bring different perspectives, who've experienced adversity. And I think gaining the empathy, gaining the skills, gaining the knowledge, and really being good listeners. And I think, again, if you approach the relationships at a fullness level, not like, oh, I want to learn about all your emptiness because I haven't experienced adversity, so I have to learn about all your problems. Who wants to? I don't want to be your friend if you want to learn all about that and not about my good. And so I think you have to build relationships in that way. And I think there are tools, and I do write about those, and Public Allies has a lot on our website and stuff. But there's a lot of tools we use to help people broker and break through those relationships.
Well, one of the challenges for senior leaders, I think it's fair to say, is that a lot of them are coming from a very specific perspective. And oftentimes you'll hear when they look at hiring or bringing on new people, whether it's millennials or just people of different backgrounds, there's always this challenge in connecting. And is there any advice that you can give those senior leaders who are trying to do the right thing, but sometimes not realizing that the conversations they're having, the reason they're not connecting is because they're missing that experience piece that allows them to do that?
Well, again, I think as a senior leader, you have to look at your own set of relationships. What are your inputs? What kind of perspectives do you have, not just among those inside your organization, but through your social networks, through your contacts in the community? And so what boards, organizations are you involved with, and how diverse are the people you're engaging with there, and what are you learning from that experience? And so I think that as a senior leader, it's not enough to say, I'm just going to bring one person, that's token and it doesn't work. You have to really create an experience in which, again, in an asset-based way, you approach community and relationships and build different relationships and bring those to the table. And for us, we recruit young people in 23 cities. We don't do it because our staff know everybody. We do it because we build relationships, and we realize, like, if we don't have a lot of folks, for example, with disabilities, we need to build relationships with those organizations. If we don't have a lot of folks coming out of foster care, we know there's some incredible young talent coming out of that population, which people are surprised by. But God, talk about people who have overcome adversity in many cases and have incredible leadership. But then you have to build relationships with organizations. So I think, again, it's what relationships are you building to create avenues for relationships and pipelines for yourself that are different.
But you've got to be deliberate, right?
You have to be deliberate. As I say, it's intention and attention. It's not something you can believe in. It's not something you put on a mission statement. It's something you do. And I think people know whether you do it or not because they can look. There's a simple pass-fail argument. You look around the table and say, are you doing it or not?
Because I love your perspective so much, I would be really interested to hear what makes you hopeful when you look forward.
Well, I think I'm hopeful. I mean, I think it's an odd week for hope. But I want to say that I'm hopeful because I do see, one is the young people I do meet today, and I have the fortune of we hire about 700 a year, are just inspire me endlessly. And our alumni, who I continue to contact every day. I mean, I'm in Indianapolis. One of my young staff here in Indianapolis, he just moved, unfortunately for here, but he, at the age of 28, went to college at Ivy Tech Community College here in Indianapolis. He was a father of 4, and he goes to community college at the age of 28. He just enrolled and is now starting up to finish his undergraduate degree at University of Pennsylvania. And he did a crowd fundraising campaign to support his family in making this move because, he doesn't have a lot of income and he's moving across the country with 4 kids and starting college. And he called the campaign From Ivy Tech to Ivy League. But Casey provides me hope because his story and his ambition at a later, most people at 28 would give up and say, well, I've got a full-time job now, I've got 4 kids, I can't do this. He set the highest goal possible and he achieved it. And I see so much incredible talent like Casey in communities that I get to work with. And so I'm filled with hope. And at the same time, I'm very real about the challenges we face in our communities today in continuing to really build leadership and build community from the bottom up.
As we all should be. Thank you so much to Paul Schmitz.